Brazil was crying. On July 16, 1950, nearly 200,000 people packed the Maracanazo Stadium in Rio de Janeiro to watch their nation claim its first World Cup. Brazil only needed a draw against Uruguay. The newspapers had already printed the celebration headlines. The samba bands were ready. The fireworks were loaded. And then Uruguay scored. Twice. The final whistle blew, and the largest crowd ever assembled for a sporting event fell into a silence so deep that witnesses later said you could hear grown men weeping in the streets. Brazilians would come to call this day the Maracanazo, the disaster, a wound so deep it would take an entire generation to heal. Hundreds of miles away, in the small city of Bauru in the state of Sao Paulo, a 9-year-old boy watched his father sit in front of the radio and cry. His father was a man who never cried. A former footballer himself, João Ramos do Nascimento, known to everyone as Dondinho, had once been one of the finest center forwards in southern Minas Gerais. He was famous for his heading ability. In one match playing for a club called Huracan, Dondinho scored 5 goals with his head alone in a single game. 5 headers. People who saw it never forgot. But a devastating knee injury had ended everything. The clubs discarded him without ceremony. Now Dondinho limped through his days doing odd jobs, cleaning floors, scraping together whatever work he could find to feed his family. Football had given him everything, and then taken it all away. And on this night, listening to his country's dreams collapse on the radio, Dondinho wept not just for Brazil, but for every version of his own life that might have been. According to the most popular version of the story, the boy walked over to his father and made a promise. "Don't cry, Papa. I will win the World Cup for Brazil." Most fathers would have smiled, wiped their eyes, and forgotten it by morning. But this boy's name was Edson Arantes do Nascimento. The world would come to know him as Pelé, and he would keep his promise 3 times over. The family had not always lived in Bauru. Edson was born on October 23, 1940, in the tiny town of Três Corações, which means 3 hearts, in the state of Minas Gerais. His parents named him after Thomas Edison, the inventor. They left out the I. They could barely afford the birth, let alone worry about spelling. His mother, Celeste Arantes, a woman of fierce will and quiet strength, called him Dico. Everyone in the family called him Dico. The Pelé name would come later, and it would not come kindly. When Dondinho's playing career collapsed under the weight of his ruined knee, the family drifted from town to town, chasing his fading opportunities. They lived in Lorena, in São Lourenço, wherever a struggling club would give Dondinho a chance. When Edson was 4, the family settled in Bauru, where Dondinho joined Bauru Atlético Clube. It was here, on the dusty streets of a working-class neighborhood, that the boy fell in love with football. The problem was simple. They had no money for a ball. So Edson and the other neighborhood boys did what poor Brazilian children had done for generations. They stuffed old socks with newspaper and rags, tied them tight with string, and played with that. When socks were not available, they used grapefruits. The ball was never round. The pitch was never flat. The goalposts were made of shoes. Nobody wore boots. And none of that mattered. Because on those broken streets, kicking that lumpy sock ball, Edson began to develop something that coaches cannot teach and money cannot buy. The Brazilians have a word for it, ginga. It means the way you move, the rhythm in your body, the fluidity that turns football from a sport into a dance. Ginga did not come from a textbook. It came from the streets. It came from poverty. And long before that, it came from something much older and much more painful. When Portuguese colonizers brought enslaved Africans to Brazil beginning in the 16th century, those enslaved people developed a form of movement called capoeira. Part dance, part combat, part survival. It was a way of fighting disguised as art. When slavery was abolished in 1888, the descendants of those enslaved people carried capoeira's fluidity into every part of Brazilian culture, into music, into dance, into the way they walked, and eventually into the way they played football. Ginga was capoeira's grandchild. It was Brazil's gift to the sport, and it was running through the veins of a barefoot boy in Bauru who did not yet know what he was capable of. Celeste hated football. She had watched it destroy her husband's body and their financial security. She saw the sport as a trapdoor, a beautiful illusion that dropped you into poverty the moment your body failed. She worked as a domestic cleaner, earning barely enough to keep the family fed, and she had no patience for her son's obsession with a game that had given his father nothing but a bad knee and broken dreams. But Dondinho understood something that Celeste could not yet see. He recognized in his son a talent that went beyond anything he had possessed himself. So quietly, patiently, without making promises or raising expectations, Dondinho taught the boy everything he knew: how to control the ball, how to use both feet, how to see a pass before it existed. In Bauru, young Edson also discovered futsal, the fast indoor version of football that was rapidly growing across Brazil. The smaller pitch, the heavier ball, the claustrophobic speed of the game. Everything happened in tight spaces. You had to think faster than your feet could move. Years later, Pelé would credit futsal with shaping his ability to make instant decisions under pressure. The indoor game was a laboratory, and the boy was conducting experiments every afternoon. He also worked. To help the family survive, young Edson took jobs in tea shops, serving customers and cleaning tables. He shined shoes on the street. He did whatever was needed. Poverty was not a backdrop to his childhood. It was the architecture of every day. And somewhere during those years, the nickname arrived. The exact origins of the name Pelé remain unclear, even to the man himself. One widely told version says it came from a mispronunciation of the name Pelé, a goalkeeper his father admired, and that other children used the mangled word to tease him. Another version links it to pelada, the Brazilian term for informal street football. What is documented is that the boy hated it. He despised the nickname. He got into fights over it. He could not shake it. The cruelest irony of his life is that the name given to mock him would become the most famous name in the history of sport. By his early teens, Edson was the best young player anyone in Bauru had ever seen. He led the junior squad of Bauru Atlético Clube, the same club his father had played for, to 2 São Paulo State Youth Championships. His coach was a man named Waldemar de Brito. This is where the story turns. Waldemar de Brito was not an ordinary youth coach. He was a former Brazilian international who had represented his country at the 1934 World Cup in Italy. He had played at the highest level. He had seen the best players in the world up close. And when he watched this skinny teenager from the streets of Bauru move with a football, he saw something he had never seen before. De Brito went to the boy's family. He told Dondinho and Celeste that their son was extraordinary, that he needed to be at a professional club, that he was ready. Celeste resisted. Of course she did. Her son was 15. She had watched football ruin one man she loved. She was not about to let it take another. But De Brito was persistent, and Dondinho, who understood both the risk and the opportunity, quietly supported the idea. In 1956, Waldemar de Brito brought the teenager to Santos Football Club. According to a story that has been repeated countless times, De Brito told the Santos directors that this boy would become the greatest player in the world. Whether he used those exact words or not, history would prove him spectacularly right. On September 7, 1956, just weeks before his 16th birthday, Edson Arantes do Nascimento played his first professional match. It was a friendly against Corinthians de Santo André. Santos won 7-1. The teenager scored. Within months, he was the leading scorer at the club. Within a year, he was called up to the Brazilian national team. At 16 years old, he made his international debut. But making the team and proving you belonged were two very different things. In 1958, Brazil qualified for the World Cup in Sweden. The squad was selected, and a debate erupted that could have changed the course of football history. The Brazilian Football Confederation had hired a psychologist named João Carvalhais to evaluate the players. After testing the teenager, Carvalhais delivered his verdict. The boy was too young. He lacked fighting spirit. He was too immature to handle the physical punishment of international football. The psychologist recommended, in no uncertain terms, that Pelé should not go to Sweden. Coach Vicente Feola listened to the assessment. Then he ignored it. "You may be right," Feola reportedly told the psychologist. "The problem is that you know nothing about football." The boy went to Sweden. But Feola was cautious.
He kept both Pelé and the dazzling winger Garrincha on the bench for Brazil's opening matches. The team struggled. They drew goalless with England and barely beat Austria. The football was tense and stiff, nothing like the flowing Brazilian style the world expected.
The players themselves revolted. Several senior members of the squad went to Faiola and demanded that Garrincha and Pelé be given a chance. Faiola relented. For the third group match against the Soviet Union, both men started. What followed was later described as the greatest 3 minutes in football history. From the first whistle, Garrincha was unplayable, twisting Soviet defenders into confusion. Pelé moved with a confidence that made no sense for a 17-year-old at his first World Cup. Brazil won 2-0. The tournament cracked open. In the quarterfinal against Wales, the match was locked at 0-0 with 66 minutes gone. Then Pelé received the ball inside the box, controlled it on his chest, flicked it over a bewildered Welsh defender, and volleyed it into the net without the ball ever touching the ground. It was the only goal of the match. He was 17 years and 239 days old, the youngest scorer in World Cup history. 4 days later, in the semifinal against France, Pelé scored a hat trick. France had Jules Fontaine, the tournament's top scorer, but it did not matter. Brazil won 5-2. The teenager had scored 3 goals in a World Cup semifinal, the youngest player ever to achieve such a thing. And then came the final. June 29, 1958, Rasunda Stadium, Solna, just outside Stockholm. 49,737 people in attendance. Brazil against the host nation, Sweden. Sweden struck first. Just 4 minutes in, Niels Lidholm, the veteran Swedish forward, fired past Brazil's goalkeeper Gilmar. The stadium erupted. The Swedish fans smelled an upset. Brazil's players looked, for a brief moment, as if the old fear might swallow them again. The ghost of 1950, the Maracanazo, that ancient Brazilian terror of falling short when it mattered most. It lasted approximately 5 minutes. Vavá equalized in the 9th minute. He scored again in the 32nd. And then, in the 55th minute, the boy from Bauru did something that the football world had never seen. Nilton Santos delivered a cross into the box. Pelé, standing with his back to goal, controlled the ball on his chest. He did not turn immediately. Instead, he flicked the ball up and over the head of the nearest Swedish defender, who was left grasping at air. Then, before the ball touched the ground, Pelé volleyed it past the goalkeeper. The Swedish crowd, who were supposed to be cheering for their own team, rose to their feet and applauded. Even they understood they were watching something that transcended nationality, something that belonged to football itself. Zagallo added a 4th, and in the final minute, Pelé scored again. A teammate launched a long ball into the box. Pelé leapt, rising above the Swedish defense with an almost impossible combination of timing and power, and headed the ball into the net. 5-2. Brazil were world champions for the first time. At the final whistle, Pelé collapsed on the pitch and wept. He was 17 years old, the youngest World Cup champion in history. A boy who had grown up kicking a sock stuffed with newspaper on the broken streets of Bauru had just scored 6 goals at a World Cup and lifted the trophy for his nation. The Swedish crowd gave Brazil a standing ovation. King Gustav VI Adolf sought out Pelé before the ceremony to shake his hand. The world's newspapers scrambled to explain who this teenager was and where he had come from. And back in Bauru, Dondinho sat by his radio. The man with the ruined knee who cleaned floors for a living heard his son's name echo across the world. The promise had been kept. But Pelé was not finished. Brazil returned to the World Cup in 1962 in Chile. Pelé scored in the opening match against Mexico, but was injured in the second game against Czechoslovakia. A torn muscle in his groin ended his tournament. He could only watch from the sideline as his teammates, led by the incomparable Garrincha, carried Brazil to a second consecutive World Cup title. Pelé had his second winner's medal, but the victory felt incomplete. He had contributed almost nothing. The 1966 World Cup in England was worse. Pelé was targeted with brutal, cynical fouls. Bulgaria and Portugal both deployed defenders whose primary job was to kick him off the pitch, and the referees offered little protection. Brazil were eliminated in the group stage. It was humiliating. At 25, Pelé swore he would never play in another World Cup. He changed his mind. By 1970, an older, wiser, more complete Pelé arrived in Mexico for what he knew would be his final World Cup. And this time, the Brazilian team assembled around him was arguably the greatest football team ever assembled. Jairzinho, Tostão, Rivellino, Carlos Alberto, Gerson, every name a legend. The football they played was not merely effective, it was beautiful. It was the purest expression of ginga the world had ever seen on a competitive stage. Brazil won every match. They beat Czechoslovakia, England, Romania, Peru, Uruguay. And in the final, they destroyed Italy 4-1. The fourth goal, finished by captain Carlos Alberto with a devastating right-footed strike after a flowing team move of breathtaking precision, is still widely considered the greatest team goal in World Cup history. Pelé did not score it. He did not need to. He had set it in motion with a casual, almost arrogant pass that completed the most beautiful sequence football had ever produced. 3 World Cups, the only player in history to achieve it, a record that still stands today and may stand forever. By the time his career ended, Pelé had scored over 1,000 professional goals. The exact number has been debated for decades because many of his matches were exhibition games and friendlies across dozens of countries. The commonly cited figure is 1,283 goals in 1,363 appearances, but some historians place the verified total lower. What is beyond dispute is that no one, before or since, has scored at such a rate for so long at such a level. After Brazil's 1958 triumph, the Brazilian government declared Pelé a national treasure, a legal status designed to prevent European clubs from signing him. It worked. Despite enormous offers from clubs across Europe, Pelé remained at Santos for nearly 2 decades, only leaving Brazil in 1975 to join the New York Cosmos and help popularize football in the United States. His influence extended far beyond the pitch. In 1969, Santos traveled to Nigeria for an exhibition match during the country's brutal civil war between the government and the breakaway Republic of Biafra. According to a story that became famous around the world, a 48-hour ceasefire was agreed so that both sides could safely watch Pelé play. Pelé himself repeated this story in interviews for decades. However, the truth is more complicated. Nigerian researchers who examined contemporary newspaper accounts from the period found no evidence of a formal ceasefire. Pelé acknowledged the uncertainty in his 2007 autobiography, writing, "I'm not sure that is entirely true, but the Nigerians certainly made sure the Biafrans wouldn't invade Lagos while we were there." The facts remain disputed. What is not disputed is that a country in the middle of a civil war considered the presence of one football player significant enough to take extraordinary security measures. That in itself tells you everything about who Pelé was. He became a global ambassador. He served as Brazil's Minister of Sports. He was named Athlete of the Century by the International Olympic Committee. He met presidents, kings, and popes. He appeared on every continent. He spoke to audiences who had never watched a football match and made them understand why it mattered. And through all of it, the nickname endured. The word that had been invented to humiliate a poor boy in Bauru became the most recognized name in sport, more recognized than his birth name, more recognized than most countries. A single word, 5 letters, Pelé. On December 29, 2022, Edson Arantes do Nascimento died in São Paulo. He was 82 years old. The cause was multiple organ failure following a long battle with colon cancer. Brazil declared 3 days of national mourning. His coffin was displayed at the center of the pitch at Vila Belmiro, the Santos stadium where he had played for 19 years. More than 200,000 people came to pay their respects. World leaders, athletes, musicians, and ordinary Brazilians stood in line together to say goodbye. Some said Pelé did not change football. They said he was football. That the sport before him and the sport after him were fundamentally different things. He took a game that belonged to Europe and made it belong to the world. He proved that genius could come from anywhere, from a dirt street in Bauru, from a sock stuffed with newspaper,
from a boy whose family could not afford shoes. Ginga was dismissed as street tricks. Pelé made it an art form. Poverty was supposed to be an obstacle. He made it the foundation. A mocking nickname was supposed to wound him. He made it immortal. There is a moment that captures everything. June 29th, 1958. A 17-year-old boy stands on a football pitch in Sweden. He has just scored 2 goals in a World Cup final. He has just made his country champions of the world for the first time. Tears are streaming down his face. His teammates carry him on their shoulders. Somewhere in Bauru, a man with a bad knee is listening to the radio. The boy kept his promise.